F1 World Championship Edition is a racing game released for the Sega Genesis in 1995. It features various tracks and teams from the 1994 Formula One World Championship season. The game allows players to race in single races or attempt to win the championship by competing in a full season. Despite the promising premise and recognizable branding, the game's poor graphics, limited gameplay options, and lack of depth found the controls to be top 10 flopped making it difficult to navigate the tracks. Additionally, the AI opponents were too easy to beat, offering little challenge to players. Overall, F1 World Championship Edition failed to live up to expectations and was quickly forgotten by racing game enthusiasts. Nigel Mansell's World Championship Racing is a racing game developed for the Sega Genesis console. The game puts players in the shoes of Nigel Mansell, a famous British Formula One driver, and requires them to compete in various racing events to win the World Championship. The game includes a range of cars and tracks, and players can customize their vehicles to improve their performance. Despite the game's impressive visuals and sound effects, it is considered one of the top 10 flopped racing games on Sega Genesis. This is due to several reasons. Firstly, the game suffers from poor controls, making it difficult for players to navigate the tracks properly. The AI opponents are also overly aggressive, making it frustrating to compete against them. Secondly, the game lacks depth, with only a limited number of tracks and events available. This means that players quickly become bored with the game after a short period of time. Finally, the game's overall presentation is uninspiring, with a lack of innovation and originality. In summary, despite its promising concept, Nigel Mansell's World Championship Racing fails to deliver a compelling racing experience due to its poor controls.
Released in various computer systems at the time. For the most part, it's a fairly solid port. Also adding the racing games seem to have a couple of compulsory cars, like the sporty red convertible or the sleek futuristic-looking dark. Do nothing but slow you down and boost them further down the track with
different weather conditions and obstacles to make
every race to the rest, which isn't all that demanding compared to similar games. Even better, on top of that, there is a password system, so I like those, which makes it shine and keep it interesting. And I wasn't expecting any of them. While there is no time
the graphics and sound were
the race environment
subpar
construction
for the time,
system was supposed to be a big feature of this port, even featuring in the title of the game.
The gameplay was also criticized.
The graphics really stood out to me in this game, not because of the amount of detail, which is fairly in line with competitors, but the amount of effects instead.
Furthermore,
this causes further issues since the Mega Drive is such an easy console to reset with your toe.
At the time, such as Super Mario Kart and F-Zero. Lotus 2 Rex failed to capture the attention of gamers and was quickly forgotten, making it one of the most disappointing racing games that was released for Sega Genesis in 1990. In the game, players take on the role of a Formula One driver and compete in various races around the world. The game features realistic graphics and sound effects, as well as a variety of different cars and tracks to race on. Despite its promising premise, Super Monaco GP is often regarded as one of the top 10 flopped racing games on Sega Genesis. This is largely due to the game's poor AI and lack of variety in gameplay. The AI drivers are often too easy to beat, which makes the game feel boring and repetitive after a while. Additionally, the game only features a handful of tracks, which can make the races feel stale and uninteresting. Overall, while Super Monaco GP had the potential to be a great racing game, its lack of variety and poor AI ultimately led to its downfall. While it may still be enjoyable for some players, it is unlikely to be remembered as one of the great racing games of its time. Ayrton Senna's Super Monaco GP2 is a racing game that was released for the Sega Genesis console in the early 1990s. It was based on the real-world Formula One racing series and featured Brazilian racing driver Ayrton Senna as its primary spokesperson. The game was generally well received by critics upon its release, with many praising its realistic graphics and challenging gameplay. However, It ultimately failed to live up to the hype and expectations of fans of the genre. One of the biggest reasons why Ayrton Senna's Super Monaco GP2 is considered one of the top 10 flopped racing games on Sega Genesis is due to its difficulty. While some players appreciated the game's realistic physics and handling, others found it frustratingly challenging and unforgiving. The game's steep learning curve and lack of accessibility turned off many casual gamers, which limited its appeal and long-term replay value. Another factor that contributed to the game's failure was its limited content. While Ayrton Senna's Super Monaco GP2 featured a variety of different racetracks and teams to choose from, it lacked the depth and variety of other racing games of its time. This made it difficult for the game to stand out in a crowded market and maintain its relevance over time. Overall, while Ayrton Senna's Super Monaco GP2 had its strengths, it ultimately failed to live up to the expectations of fans of the racing genre. Its challenging gameplay and limited content made it a niche title that struggled to find a broad audience, and it remains a footnote in the history of racing games on the Sega Genesis. Michael Andretti's World GP is a racing game released in 1991 for Sega Genesis. The game was named after the famous American race car driver Michael Andretti and aimed to offer players the experience of competing in the Formula One World Championship. However, the game failed to achieve success and is considered one of the top 10 flopped racing games on Sega Genesis. One of the reasons for this is that the game lacked some of the key features that racing enthusiasts were looking for, such as realistic physics and a sense of speed. Additionally, the game had poor graphics and sound quality, making it difficult for players to immerse themselves in the game. Furthermore, the gameplay was too simplistic and repetitive, with only a few tracks and limited customization options. The AI opponents were also criticized for being too easy to beat, making the game lack the challenge that players wanted. Overall, Michael Andretti's World GP failed to live up to expectations and did not offer a satisfying racing experience for players. It lacked the necessary features and qualities to compete with other popular racing games on the Sega Genesis, ultimately resulting in its flop status. Newman Haas IndyCar featuring Nigel Mansell is a racing game that was released for Sega Genesis in 1994. The game is based on the IndyCar racing series and features real-life driver Nigel Mansell. Despite its promising concept, the game ultimately flopped due to a number of issues. One major problem was the game's poor graphics and lackluster gameplay. The cars and tracks looked very simplistic and lacked detail, while the controls were clunky and unresponsive. Another issue was the game's limited content. There were only a handful of tracks to race on and a small selection of cars to choose from. This made the game feel repetitive and boring after only a few races. Lastly, the game suffered from a lack of replay value. There were no extra modes or features to keep players engaged, and the game's overall simplicity meant that there was little incentive to keep coming back to it. Overall, while Newman Haas IndyCar featuring Nigel Mansell had the potential to be a great racing game, it ultimately fell short due to its poor graphics, limited content, and lack of replay value. IndyCar Racing is a racing game that was released for the Sega Genesis in 1994. The game was based on the popular American open-wheel racing series, IndyCar. Unfortunately, the game did not do well in terms of sales and is considered one of the top 10 flopped racing games on Sega Genesis. One reason for this is that the game was not as visually impressive as other racing games of the time. The graphics were average and lacked the detail and polish of other games. Another reason was that the gameplay was not very exciting. The races were often slow-paced, and the controls were not very responsive, making it difficult to maneuver the cars. Additionally, the game lacked features that were standard in other racing games of the time, such as a multiplayer mode. The lack of multiplayer meant that players could only race against the computer, which quickly became boring. Overall, IndyCar Racing failed to impress players and critics alike. It lacked the visual appeal, gameplay, and features that players expected from a racing game. As a result, it is considered one of the top 10 flopped racing games on Sega Genesis. Mario Andretti Racing Experience was a racing game released on the Sega Genesis in 1994. Players could choose to race with Mario Andretti or one of 6 other drivers on various tracks around the world. The game had decent graphics and sound effects, but it fell short in several areas. Firstly, the controls were overly sensitive and difficult to master, making it frustrating for players to navigate the tracks. Secondly, the game lacked a multiplayer, which was a major drawback for a racing game. Lastly, the game had limited replay value as there were only a few tracks available and no real progression system. Overall, Mario Andretti Racing Experience failed to deliver a satisfying racing experience and was overshadowed by other popular racing games on the Sega Genesis, such as Road Rash and Super Monaco GP. As a result, it is considered one of the top 10 flopped racing games on Sega Genesis. ESPN Speed World is a racing video game released on Sega Genesis in 1994. In this game, players control race cars and compete in various racing events. The game features real-life tracks and cars from the NASCAR and IndyCar racing series. However, ESPN Speed World is considered one of the top 10 flopped racing games on Sega Genesis. This is because the game suffers from several issues that make it less enjoyable to play. For one, the game's graphics are subpar, with low-quality visuals that make it difficult to see what's happening on the track. The controls are also clunky and unresponsive, making it hard to maneuver the cars during races. Additionally, the game lacks any sort of depth or variety, with only a handful of tracks and events available to play. This makes the game feel repetitive and boring after a short amount of time. Overall, ESPN Speed World fails to deliver a satisfying racing experience, which is why it's considered one of the flopped racing games on Sega Genesis.